Russian aggression. The money had been appropriated by Congress and certified by the Department of Defense. Multiple witnesses confirmed that there was unanimous support for the military aid to Ukraine. Can we listen to that, please?
From what you witnessed, did anybody in the national security community support withholding the assistance?
No.
I never heard anyone advocate for holding the aid.
And the entire interagency supported the continuation of the security assistance, isn't that right?
That is correct.
I and others sat in astonishment. The Ukrainians were fighting Russians and counted on not only the training and weapons, but also the assurance of U.S. support.
Professor Feldman, you have stated that the President's demand to the President of Ukraine constituted an abuse of power. How does the President's decision to withhold military aid affect your analysis?
It means that it wasn't just an abuse of power because the President was serving his own personal interests, but also an abuse of power insofar as the President was putting American national security interests behind his own personal interests. So it brought together two important aspects of the abuse of power: self-gain and undercutting our national security interests.
The evidence points to President Trump using military aid for his personal benefit, not for the benefit of any official U.S. policy. Professor Carlin, how would the framers have interpreted that?
Well, I can't speak for the framers themselves, obviously. My view is that they would say that the President's authority to use foreign aid, and they probably couldn't have imagined we even were giving foreign aid because we were a tiny, poor country then. So it's a little hard to translate that. But what they would have said is a president who doesn't think first about the security of the United States is not doing what his oath requires him to do, which was faithfully execute the laws, hear a law appropriating money, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
Thank you. And let's go back to a segment of Mr. Turley's quote, that if you can establish intent to use public office for personal gain, you have a viable, impeachable offense. Mr. Feldman, do we meet that criteria here?
In my view, the evidence does meet that criteria, and that's the judgment that you should be making.
Ms. Carlin?
Yes, and one question I would just have for the minority members of the committee is, if you were convinced that the President held up the aid because he thought it would help his reelection, would you vote to impeach him? Because I think that's really the question that everyone on this committee should be asking. And if they conclude yes, then they should vote to impeach.
Mr. Gerhardt?
Yes, I agree. And one thing I would add is that much talk has been made here about the term bribery and court decisions with respect to bribery. It's your job, it's the House's job to define bribery, not the courts. You follow your judgment on that.
I want to thank the witnesses, all of the witnesses, for coming and testifying today. This is not an easy decision, it's not a comfortable decision, but it's one that's necessary. We all take an oath to protect the Constitution. Our military men and women go and put their lives on the line for the Constitution, and we have an obligation to follow the Constitution, whether it's convenient or easy. Thank you, and I yield back the balance.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Roby.
Very quickly, Professor Turley, would you like to respond?
Yes, I would. First of all, what was said in that column is exactly what I've said in my testimony. The problem is not that abuse of power can never be an impeachable offense. You just have to prove it, and you haven't. It's not enough to say, I infer this was the purpose. I infer that this is what was intended, when you're not actually subpoenaing people with direct knowledge. And instead you're saying we must vote in this rocket docket of an impeachment.
So this leads to my statement that I'd like to make. Of course, the United States House of Representatives has initiated impeachment inquiries against the President of the United States only 3 times in our nation's history prior to this one. Those impeachment inquiries were done in this committee, the Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over impeachment matters. Here, in 2019, under this inquiry, fact witnesses that have been called were in front of the Intelligence Committee. We have been given no indication that this committee will conduct substantive hearings with fact witnesses. As a member serving on the Judiciary Committee, I can say that the process in which we are participating is insufficient, unprecedented, and grossly inadequate. Sitting before us is a panel of witnesses containing 4 distinguished law professors from some of our country's finest educational institutions. I do not doubt that each of you are extremely well-versed in the subject of constitutional law. And yes, there is precedent for similar panels in the aforementioned history, but only after specific charges had been made known and the underlying facts presented in full due to an exhaustive investigation. However, I don't understand why we are holding this hearing at this time with these witnesses. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle have admitted they don't know what articles of impeachment they will consider. How does anyone expect a panel of law professors to weigh in on the legal grounds for impeachment charges prior to even knowing what the charges brought by this committee are going to be? Some of my Democrat colleagues have stated over and over that impeachment should be a nonpartisan process, and I agree. One of my colleagues in the Democratic Party stated, and I quote, "Impeachment is so divisive to the country that unless there is something so compelling and overwhelming and bipartisan, I don't think we should go down that path because it divides the country." My Democratic colleagues have stated numerous times that they are on a truth-seeking and fact-finding mission. Another one of my Democratic colleagues said, and I quote, "We have a responsibility to consider the facts that emerge squarely and with the best interest of our country, not our party in our hearts." These type of historic proceedings, regardless of political beliefs, ought to be about fact-finding and truth-seeking, but that is not what this has turned out to be. Again, no disrespect to these witnesses, but for all I know, this is the only hearing that we will have, and none of them are fact witnesses. My colleagues are saying one thing and doing something completely different. No member of Congress can look their constituents in the eye and say this is a comprehensive, fact-finding, truth-seeking mission. Ranking Member Collins and members of the minority on this committee have written 6 letters over the past month to Chairman Nadler asking for procedural fairness, for all the underlying evidence to be transmitted to the Judiciary Committee, to expand the number of witnesses and have an even more bipartisan panel here today, and for clarity on today's impeachment proceedings since we haven't received evidence to review. The minority has yet to receive a response to these letters. Right here today is another very clear example for all Americans to truly understand the ongoing lack of transparency and openness with these proceedings. The witness list for this hearing was not released until late Monday afternoon. Opening statements from the witnesses today were not distributed until late last night, and the Intelligence Committee's finalized report has yet to be presented to this committee. You hear from those in the majority that process is a Republican talking point, when in reality it is an American talking point. Process is essential to the institution. A thoughtful, meaningful process of this magnitude with such great implications should be demanded by the American people. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Mr. Jeffries.
I did not serve in the military, but my 81-year-old father did. He was an Air Force veteran stationed in Germany during the height of the Cold War in the late 1950s. He was a teenager from inner city Newark, a stranger in a foreign land, serving on the western side of the Berlin Wall. My dad proudly wore the uniform because he swore an oath to the Constitution and believed in American democracy. I believe in American democracy. We remain the last best hope on earth. It is in that spirit that we proceed today. Professor Carlin, in America, we believe in free and fair elections. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
But authoritarian regimes do not. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thomas Jefferson once wrote, or John Adams once wrote to Thomas Jefferson on December 6, 1787, and stated, "You are apprehensive of foreign interference, intrigue, influence. So am I. But as often as elections happen, the danger of foreign influence recurs. Professor Carlin, how important was the concept of free and fair elections to the framers of the Constitution?
Honestly, it was less important to them than it's become in our Constitution since then. And if you'll remember, one of the things that turned me into a lawyer was seeing Barbara Jordan, who was the first female lawyer I'd ever seen in practice, say on the committee that we, the people, didn't include people like her in 1789, but through a process of amendment, we have done that. And so elections are more important to us today as a constitutional matter than they were even to the framers.
And is it fair to say that an election cannot be reasonably characterized as free and fair if it's manipulated by foreign interference?
That's correct.
And the framers of the Constitution were generally and deeply concerned with the threat of foreign interference in the domestic affairs of the United States, true?
Yes.
And why were they so deeply concerned?
Because foreign nations don't have our interests at heart. They have their interests at heart.
And would the framers find it acceptable for an American president to pressure a foreign government to help him win an election?
I think they'd find it unacceptable for a president to ask a foreign government to help him, whether they put pressure on him or not.
Direct evidence shows that on a July 25th phone call, the president uttered 5 words: "Do us a favor, though." He pressured the Ukrainian government to target an American citizen for political gain, and at the same time, simultaneously withheld $391 million in military aid. Now, Ambassador Bill Taylor, West Point graduate, Vietnam War hero, Republican-appointed diplomat, discussed this issue of military aid. Here is a clip of his testimony.
Again, our holding up of security assistance that would go to a country that is fighting aggression from Russia for no good policy reason, no good substantive reason, no good national security reason is wrong.
To the extent the military aid was being withheld as part of an effort to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election, is that behavior impeachable?
Yes, it is, and if I could go back to one of the words you read, when the president said, "do us a favor," he was using the royal we there. It wasn't a favor for the United States. He should have said, "do me a favor," because only kings say us when they mean me.
And is it correct that an abuse of power that strikes at the heart of our democracy falls squarely within the definition of a high crime and misdemeanor?
Yes, it does.
Some of my colleagues have suggested that impeachment would overturn the will of the people. The American people expressed their will in November of 2018. The will of the people elected a new majority. The will of the people elected a House that would not function as a wholly owned subsidiary of this administration. The will of the people elected a House that understands we are a separate and co-equal branch of government. The will of the people elected a House that understands we have a constitutional responsibility to serve as a check and balance on an out-of-control executive branch. The president abused his power and must be held accountable. No one is above the law. America must remain the last best hope on earth. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Gates.
The will of the American people also elected Donald Trump to be the president of the United States in the 2016 election, and there's one party that can't seem to get over it. Now, we understand the fact that in 2018 you took the House of Representatives, and we haven't spent our time during your tenure in power trying to remove the Speaker of the House, trying to delegitimize your ability to govern. Frankly, we'd love to govern with you. We'd love to pass USMCA. We'd love to put out a helping hand to our seniors and lower prescription drug prices. It's the will of the people you ignore when you continue down this terrible road of impeachment. Professor Gerhardt, you gave money to Barack Obama, right?
My family did, yes.
4 times?
That sounds about right. Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I have a series of unanimous consent requests relating to Professor Feldman's work. The first, Noah Feldman, Trump's wiretap tweets raise risk of impeachment.
Gentleman will suspend.
My time.
We'll take that time off. Has the gentleman submitted, have we seen that material?
We can provide it to you, as is
And
typical
we'll
for
consider
unanimous.
and we'll consider the unanimous consent request later after we review
Very
the
well,
material.
very well. Thank you.
The gentleman may continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Feldman wrote articles entitled, "Trump's Wiretap Tweets Raise Risk of Impeachment." He then wrote, "Mar-a-Lago ad belongs in impeachment file." And then Mr. Jake Flanagan wrote in Quartz, "A Harvard law professor thinks Trump could be impeached over fake news accusations." My question, Professor Feldman, is since you seem to believe that the basis for impeachment is even broader than the basis that my Democrat colleagues have laid forward, do you believe you're outside of the political mainstream on the question of impeachment?
I believe that impeachment is warranted whenever the president abuses his power for personal benefit or to corrupt the democratic process.
Did you write an article entitled, "It's Hard to Take Impeachment Seriously Now"?
Yes, I did write that
And in
article.
that article,
Back
did you
May
write,
of
hold on, I'm limited on time, sir.
2019, I wrote
Did you
that
write,
article.
since
you
the
like let me answer the
2018
question,
midterm
sir?
election, House Democrats have made it painfully clear that discussing impeachment is primarily or even exclusively a tool to weaken President Trump's chances in 2020. Did you write those words?
Until this call on July 25th, I was an impeachment skeptic. The
Very
call
well.
changed my mind, sir, and for
Thank
good
you. I
reason.
appreciate your testimony. Professor Carlin, you gave $2,000, or you gave $1,000 to Elizabeth Warren, right?
I believe so.
You gave $1,200 to Barack Obama,
I have no reason to question that.
and you gave $2,000 to Hillary Clinton.
That's correct.
Why so much more for Hillary than the other two?
Because I've been giving a lot of money to charity recently because of all of the poor people in the United States.
Well, those aren't the only folks you've been given to. Now, have you ever been on a podcast called Versus Trump?
I think I was on a live panel that the people who ran the podcast called Versus Trump.
On that, do you remember saying the following? Liberals tend to cluster more. Conservatives, especially very conservative people, tend to spread out more, perhaps because they don't even want to be around themselves. Did you say that?
Yes, I did.
Do you understand how that reflects contempt on people who are conservative?
No, what I was talking about there was the natural tendency, if you put the quote in context, the natural tendency of a compactness requirement to favor a party whose voters are more spread out.
Well,
and I do
Professor,
not have contempt
hold on.
for
Again,
conservatives.
I'm
and I
very
do not have
limited on
contempt
time,
for
Professor. And so I just have to say, when you talk about how liberals want to be around each other and cluster, and conservatives don't want to be around each other, and so they have to spread out, it makes people, you may not see this from, like the ivory towers of your law school, but it makes actual people in this country
When
feel
the
like,
president
excuse
calls
me, you don't get to interrupt me on this time. Now, let me also suggest that when you invoke the president's son's name here, when you try to make a little joke out of referencing Barron Trump, that does not lend credibility to your argument. It makes you look mean. It makes you look like you're attacking someone's family, the minor child of the President of the United States. So let's see if we can get into the facts. To all of the witnesses, if you have personal knowledge of a single material fact in the Schiff report, please raise your hand. And let the record reflect. No personal knowledge of a single fact. And you know what? That continues on the tradition that we saw from Adam Schiff, where Ambassador Taylor could not identify an impeachable offense. Mr. Kent never met with the president. Fiona Hill never heard the president reference anything regarding military aid. Mr. Hale was unaware of any nefarious activity with aid. Colonel Vindman even rejected the new Democrat talking point that bribery was invoked here. Ambassador Volker denied that there was a quid pro quo, and Mr. Morrison said there was nothing wrong on the call. The only direct evidence came from Gordon Sondland, who spoke to the President of the United States, and the President said, "I want nothing. No quid pro quo." And you know what? If wiretapping a political opponent's an impeachable offense, I look forward to reading that Inspector General's report, because maybe it's a different president we should be impeaching.
Gentleman's time has expired, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Feldman, let me begin by stating the obvious. It is not hearsay when the President tells the President of Ukraine to investigate his political adversary, is it?
It is not.
It is not hearsay when the President then confesses on national television to doing that, is it?
It is not.
It is not hearsay when administration officials testify that they hear the President say he only cares about the investigations of his political opponent, is it?
No, that is not hearsay.
And there's lots of other direct evidence in this 300-page report from the Intelligence Committee, so let's dispense with that claim by my Republican colleagues. Professor Garrity, Professor Turley, notwithstanding what he said today, wrote on August 1st, 2014, in a piece called 5 Myths About Impeachment. One of the myths he was rejecting was that impeachment required a criminal offense. And he wrote, and I quote, "An offense does not have to be indictable. Serious misconduct or a violation of public trust is enough," end quote. Was Professor Turley right when he wrote that back in 2014?
Yes, I agree with that.
Okay. Now, next I'm going to move to Professor Carlin. At the Constitutional Convention, Elbridge Gerry said, and I quote, "Foreign powers will intermeddle in our affairs and spare no expense to influence them." And in response, James Madison said that impeachment was needed because otherwise a president, and I quote, "might betray his trust to a foreign power." Professor Carlin, can you elaborate on why the framers were so concerned about foreign interference, how they accounted for these concerns, and how that relates to the facts before this committee?
So the reason that the framers were concerned about foreign interference, I think, is slightly different than the reason we are. They were concerned about it because we were such a weak country in 1789. We were small, we were poor, we didn't have an established navy, we didn't have an established army. Today the concern is a little different, which is that it will interfere with us making the decisions that are best for us as Americans.
Thank you, Professor. There are 3 known instances of the president publicly asking a foreign country to interfere in our elections. First, in 2016, the president publicly hoped that Russia would hack into the email of a political opponent, which they subsequently did. Second, based on the president's own summary of his call with Ukrainian President Zelensky, we know he asked Ukraine to announce an investigation of his chief political rival and used aid appropriated by Congress as leverage in his efforts to achieve this. And third, the president then publicly urged China to begin its own investigation. Professor Feldman, how would it impact our democracy if it became standard practice for the President of the United States to ask a foreign government to interfere in our elections?
It would be a disaster for the functioning of our democracy if our presidents regularly, as this president has done, asked foreign governments to interfere in our electoral process.
I'd like to end with a powerful warning from George Washington, who told Americans in his farewell address, and I quote, "to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government," end quote. The conduct at issue here is egregious and warrants a commensurate response. The president has openly and repeatedly solicited foreign interference in our elections. Of that, there is no doubt. This matters because inviting foreign meddling into our elections robs the American people of their sacred right to elect their own political leaders. Americans all across this country wait in long lines to exercise their right to vote and to choose their own leaders. This right does not belong to foreign governments. We fought and won a revolution over this. Free and fair elections are what separate us from authoritarians all over the world. As public servants and members of the House, we would be negligent in our duties under the Constitution if we let this blatant abuse of power go unchecked. We've heard a lot about hating this president. It's not about hating this president. It's about our love of country. It's about honoring the oath that we took to protect and defend the Constitution of this great country. And so my final question is to Professor Feldman and to Professor Carlin. In the face of this evidence, what are the consequences if this committee and this Congress refuses to muster the courage to respond to this gross abuse of power that undermined the national security of the United States, that undermined the integrity of our elections, and that undermined the confidence that we have to have in the president to not abuse the power of his office?
If this committee and this House fail to act, then you're sending a message to this president and to future presidents that it's no longer a problem if they abuse their power, it's no longer a problem if they invite other countries to interfere in our elections, and it's no longer a problem if they put the interests of other countries ahead of ours.
Professor Carlin?
I agree with Professor Feldman, and I should say just one thing, and I apologize for getting a little overheated a moment ago, but I have a constitutional right under the First Amendment to give money to candidates. At the same time, we have a constitutional duty to keep foreigners from spending money in our elections, and those two things are two sides of the same coin.
Thank you, and with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. I was struck this morning by the same thing as all my friends and colleagues on this side of the room. Chairman Nadler actually began this morning with the outrageous statement that the facts before us are undisputed. Of course, everyone here knows that that's simply not true. Every person here, every person watching at home knows full well that virtually everything here is disputed, from the fraudulent process and the broken procedure to the Democrats' unfounded claims. And the full facts are obviously not before us today. We've been allowed no fact witnesses here at all. For the first time ever, this committee, which is the one in Congress that has the actual jurisdiction over impeachment, is being given no access to the underlying evidence that Adam Schiff and his political accomplices claim supports this whole charade. This is just a shocking denial of due process. And I want to say to our witnesses, I'm also a constitutional law attorney, and under normal circumstances, I really would greatly enjoy an academic discussion with you, a debate about the contours of Article 2, Section 4. But that would be an utter waste of our time today, because as has been highlighted so many times this morning, this whole production is a sham and a reckless path to a predetermined political outcome. And I want you to know it's an outcome that was predetermined by our Democrat colleagues a long time ago. The truth is, House Democrats have been working to impeach President Donald J. Trump since the day he took his oath of office. Over the past 3 years, they've introduced 4 different resolutions seeking to impeach the president. Almost exactly 2 years ago, as one of the graphics up here shows, December 6, 2017, 58 House Democrats voted to begin impeachment proceedings. Of course, that was almost 20 months before the famous July 25th phone call with Ukraine's President Zelensky. And this other graphic up here is smaller, but it's interesting too. I think it's important to reiterate for everybody watching at home that of our 24 Democrat colleagues and friends on the other side of the room today, 17 out of 24 have already voted for impeachment. So, I mean, let's be honest. Let's not pretend that anybody cares anything about what's being said here today or the actual evidence or the facts. As Congresswoman Lofgren said, we come with open minds. That's not happening here. So much for an impartial jury. Several times this year, leading Democrats have frankly admitted in various interviews and correspondence that they really believe this entire strategy is necessary because, why? Because they want to stop the president's reelection. Even Speaker Pelosi said famously last month that, quote, it is dangerous to allow the American people to evaluate his performance at the ballot box. Speaker Pelosi has it exactly backwards. What is dangerous here is the precedent all this is setting for the future of our republic. I love what Professor Turley testified to this morning. He said, this is simply not how the impeachment of a president is done. His rhetorical question to all of our colleagues on the other side is still echoing throughout this chamber. He asked you to ask yourselves, where will this and where will you stand next time when this same kind of sham impeachment process is initiated against a president from your party? The real shame here today is that everything in Washington has become bitterly partisan, and this ugly chapter is not going to help that. It's going to make things really that much worse. President Turley said earlier that we are now living in the era that was feared by our founders, what Hamilton referred to as a period of agitated passions. I think that says it so well. This has indeed become an age of rage. President Washington warned in his farewell address in 1796 that extreme partisanship would lead us to the ruins of public liberty. Those were his words. This hyper-partisan impeachment is probably one of the most divisive and destructive things that we could possibly do to our American family. Let me tell you what I heard from my constituents in multiple town halls and meetings back in my district just 2 days ago. The people of this country are sick of this. They're sick of the politics of personal destruction. They're sick of this toxic atmosphere that is being created here, and they're deeply concerned about where all this will lead us in the years ahead, rightfully so. You know what the greatest threat is? The thing that ought to keep every single one of us up at night is the rapidly eroding trust of the American people in their institutions. One of the critical presuppositions and foundations of a self-governing people in a constitutional republic is that they will maintain a basic level of trust in their institutions, in the rule of law, in the system of justice, in the body of elected representatives, their citizen legislators in the Congress. The greatest danger of this fraudulent impeachment production is not what happens this afternoon or by Christmas or in the election next fall. The greatest danger is what this will do in the days ahead to our 243-year experiment in self-governance. What effect this foolish new precedent, this Pandora's box, will have upon our beleaguered nation 6 or 7 years from now, a decade from now, in the ruins of public liberty that are being created by this terribly short-sighted exercise today. God help us. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Swalwell.
Professor Turley, as a former prosecutor, I recognize a defense attorney trying to represent their client, especially one who has very little to work with in the way of facts. And today, you're representing the Republicans in their defense of the president. Professor,
That's not my intention, sir.
You've said that this case represents a dramatic turning point in federal impeachment precedent, the impact of which will shape and determine future cases. The House, for the first time in the modern era, asked the Senate to remove someone for conduct for which he was never charged criminally and the impropriety of which has never been tested in a court of law. But that's actually not a direct quote from what you said today. It sounds a lot like what you've argued today, but that's a quote from what you argued as a defense lawyer in a 2010 Senate impeachment trial. Professor, did you represent federal Judge Thomas Porteous?
I did indeed.
And Judge Porteous was tried on 4 articles of impeachment, ranging from engaging in a pattern of conduct that is incompatible with the trust and confidence placed in him as a federal judge, to engaging in a longstanding pattern of corrupt conduct that demonstrates his unfitness to serve as a United States District Court judge. On each count, Judge Porteous was convicted by at least 68 and up to 96 bipartisan senators. Thankfully, that Senate did not buy your argument that a federal official should not be removed if he is not charged criminally. And respectfully, Professor, we don't buy it either. But we're here because of this photo. It's a picture of President Zelensky in May of this year, standing on the eastern front of Ukraine as a hot war was taking place and up to 15,000 Ukrainians have died at the hands of Russians. I'd like to focus on the impact of President Trump's conduct, particularly with our allies and our standing in the world. This isn't just a president, as Professor Carlin has pointed out, asking for another foreign leader to investigate a political opponent. It also is a president leveraging a White House visit as well as foreign aid. As the witnesses have testified, Ukraine needs our support to defend itself against Russia. I heard directly from witnesses how important the visit and the aid were, particularly from Ambassador Taylor.
These weapons and this assistance it allows the Ukrainian military to deter further incursions by the Russians against Ukrainian territory. If that further incursion, further aggression were to take place, more Ukrainians would die.
Professor Carlin,